What if I told you that Mercedes found a way to gain tenths in qualifying using an FIA safety standard, without breaking the regulations? Because this is not a simple technical improvement, it is a play to the limit that for weeks went completely unnoticed, while with each lap launched there was something else happening in that last sector that no one could explain. How is it possible that a system designed to protect drivers ended up being used as a weapon to squeeze out extra power just before crossing the finish line? And why did the FIA have to intervene urgently to stop it? What you're about to discover now completely changes the way we understand qualifying in modern Formula One, and demonstrates the lengths to which teams are willing to go to find an advantage where no one else is looking. The starting point of this entire story is not in a visible improvement, nor in a revolutionary piece of the car, but in something much more subtle and dangerous, an interpretation of the regulations that went completely unnoticed while everyone looked the other way. Because while teams like Ferrari or McLaren focused their efforts on optimizing aerodynamics, balance or tire management, as we saw at the start of the season, where the differences were minimal and every detail counted, the real battle was being fought in a much more complex field, that of energy and its management in qualifying. The FIA, in its attempt to improve track safety, introduced a very specific rule for 2026 that seemed totally logical. When a car runs out of electrical power in the middle of a straight line, especially at extreme speeds, the loss of power cannot be sudden. It must be done progressively with a clear reduction limit of 50 kilowatts per second. This avoided dangerous situations where a car could suddenly die in acceleration, generating critical speed differences with other cars following behind at more than 300 kilometers per hour. It was a rule designed to protect, not to compete. But this is where Act 1 really begins, because in Formula One no rule exists without someone trying to reinterpret it. And Mercedes, with an extremely precise reading of the regulations, found something that the rest did not see, or did not understand in time. Within that same regulation there was an exception, a rear door designed for technical emergency situations, which allowed the MG UK to be completely disconnected without following this progressive reduction. In theory, this was intended for crashes to protect the system, not to improve performance. However, what they did was turn that exception into a perfectly calculated strategic tool. It was not about using more energy during the entire lap, nor about being faster in each sector, but about choosing the exact moment where everything is decided, the last meters before crossing the finish line. At that moment, where each thousandth defines positions, they activated this special mode and released all the remaining energy at once, without restrictions, without transition, without progressive loss. This completely changed the game. While other drivers finished their lap with a controlled and decreasing power delivery, Mercedes and also Red Bull had a final blow, a kind of extra boost that was not visible to the naked eye, but that made the difference on the stopwatch. It wasn't constant, it wasn't obvious, but it was lethal. And the most brilliant thing of all is that this play had no real consequences in qualifying. Because yes, the system had a clear penalty. After activating it, the MG UK was unusable for 60 seconds. But in that context, those 60 seconds mattered absolutely nothing. They coincided with the cool-down lap, where the driver simply returns to the pits without the need for performance. That is to say, the disadvantage was perfectly neutralized by the classification format itself. This is where the viewer must understand the magnitude of what was happening. We are not talking about a conventional improvement, we are talking about an intelligent manipulation of the regulations that allowed the result to be altered at the most critical moment without paying the price that, in theory, should exist. It was invisible, it was legal, but it completely broke the competitive balance. And while this was happening, the rest of the paddock was becoming suspicious. Because in an environment where everyone analyzes data to the millimeter, where each sector is studied, where each telemetry is compared, those small differences at the end of the lap began to raise questions. Where did that extra come from? Why did some cars seem to have a final impulse that was impossible to replicate? That was the beginning of the tension. A silent discovery that, little by little, became one of the biggest technical controversies of the season, because what seemed like a simple regulatory exception was actually an advantage designed with surgical precision. But what seemed like a perfect move soon exploded within the paddock, because in today's Formula One nothing remains hidden for long. And here begins Act 2. The reaction, political pressure, and direct intervention of the FIA that completely changes the course of this story. As the first qualifying sessions of the season progressed, the data began to speak. Rival engineers began to detect strange patterns in the last meters of the Mercedes and Red Bull's laps. It wasn't a constant improvement, it wasn't something that could be explained by fuel load or traditional engine modes. It was something punctual, surgical, and it always appeared in the same place, just before crossing the finish line. In a sport where each team has access to comparative telemetry, where absolutely everything is analyzed in detail, these differences did not take long to generate suspicions. Ferrari, Honda, and Audi began to question what was happening, not necessarily because they immediately understood the trick, but because they knew something was out of the ordinary. And when several teams start asking questions at the same time, the FIA cannot ignore it. This is where the situation escalates quickly. What was initially an intelligent interpretation of the regulations becomes a direct threat to competitive balance. Because we are not talking about a marginal advantage throughout the entire lap, but rather a final boost that could decide pole positions, key positions, and consequently, complete race strategies. The FIA then comes into play and does so with a much deeper review of the system. They analyze the use of the MGUK, review the modes of operation, and above all, the context in which this supposed emergency disconnection was being used. And what they discover is key. It was not being used as a response to a real failure, but as a deliberate, repetitive, and perfectly integrated tool in the execution of the qualifying laps. That's the breaking point, because although technically it was based on a legal exception, the spirit of the rule was being completely violated. What should have been a security mechanism had been transformed into an artificial competitive advantage. And that, in Formula One, is exactly the type of situation that the FIA seeks to eliminate. The decision is not long in coming and is also forceful. The system is prohibited with almost immediate effect, specifically starting with the Miami Grand Prix. There is no room for adaptation, there is no gray area that allows it to continue exploiting it. The door closes completely. And this is where the impact becomes even more interesting. Because eliminating this trick not only means removing a specific advantage, it means directly altering the qualifying performance of the teams that were using it. Mercedes and Red Bull lose that final blow, that extra at the most critical moment, which forces them to completely rethink the way they manage energy on a flying lap. But beyond the immediate effect on lap times, what this episode really leaves is a very clear signal. Technical warfare is more alive than ever. The teams not only compete on the track, they compete in the offices, in the interpretation of the regulations, in finding gaps that others do not see. And most disturbing of all, this is probably not an isolated case. Because if this episode has shown anything, it is that the greatest advantages are no longer always visible. They are hidden in the smallest details of the regulations. And this is where it all comes together. Because the final act is not just about a ban, it's about the real consequences and what this reveals about the future of Formula One. Removing this trick wasn't simply removing a one-time advantage, it was uprooting a tool that was specifically designed to decide rankings. And when you remove something so precise, so optimized for the key moment, the impact is immediate. Mercedes and Red Bull not only lose power, they lose their most effective weapon at the most critical moment of the entire weekend. From that moment on, the classification returns to a more traditional terrain, where the difference is made by more visible factors. Aerodynamic efficiency, the balance of the car, tire management, but above all, the real capacity of the engine within normal limits. That final blow disappears, and with it, those tenths that may seem small but in Formula One change absolutely everything. Because there is something you must understand. On the current grid, the differences are so minimal that an improvement of 50 or 100 kilowatts in the last meters can mean going from second to first, from Q2 to Q3, or even being left out. And that not only affects the classification, it affects the entire strategy on Sunday. Change starting positions, clean air, tire degradation, pit stop windows. Change entire races. But the most important thing about this Act 3 is not what is lost, but what is revealed. This case completely exposes how modern Formula One really works. It is no longer just about building the fastest car, it is about interpreting an increasingly complex, more technical and nuanced regulation better than anyone else. Mercedes didn't cheat, but she played to the limit of what the system allowed. And that is the key point. Because in this sport, the line between what is legal and what is questionable is extremely fine, and the most successful teams are precisely those who know how to move in that gray area before the rest. Furthermore, this episode also reveals something even deeper. The FIA is always one step behind innovation. It can close gaps, it can react, it can prohibit, but teams are always looking for the next gap, the next opportunity, the next detail that no one has exploited yet. And that brings us to the big conclusion of this whole story. If Mercedes was able to find such an advantage in something as specific as the management of the MGUK, what other areas of the regulations are being exploited right now without anyone knowing? Because this is not a story that ends with a ban. It's a warning. A clear sign that the real battle in Formula One is not always seen on the track. It often happens in silence, in the details, in those lines of the regulations that only a few know how to read correctly. And after everything we've seen, the conclusion is as shocking as it is uncomfortable. In today's Formula One, the real difference is not always who has the fastest car, but who best understands the cracks in the system. What Mercedes did with the MGUK was not a simple trick. It was a demonstration of how a standard created to protect can become a decisive advantage if interpreted with the right precision. They did not break the regulation, but they took it to a point where its original intention ceased to exist. And that is exactly where the controversy arises. The FIA's reaction, quick and forceful, confirms something key. When an innovation begins to directly influence the competitive outcome in such a specific way, it ceases to be a simple interpretation and becomes a problem that must be corrected. But even with the ban, the message has already been sent. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.